Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 21 November 2025. It is the 331st anniversary of the birth of François-Marie Arouet, better known by his pen name Voltaire, who was born in Paris on this date in 1694. Voltaire has been compared to Bertrand Russell, and Bertrand Russell has been called a large and complicated figure. Voltaire is also a large and complicated figure. He was a prolific writer who produced poetry, prose, and drama alike. No doubt he was at his best when acting as a controversialist, as a gadfly, and as a wit. But the influence of his prose has probably been far more influential than philosophers who stuck to more narrow and technical subjects. Despite his not being a technical philosopher, as this is usually understood, he made at least one great contribution to philosophy of history. Voltaire was the first to make philosophy of history fully explicit by writing a book titled Philosophy of History. In this sense, Voltaire is the founder of philosophy of history. But in several episodes, I've emphasized the tradition of philosophy of history that begins with St. Augustine. So there was ancient and medieval philosophy of history, even if it wasn't called that at the time when it was formulated. Philosophy of history in this original form, then, didn't know itself to be philosophy of history. It would still be accurate, however, to say that modern philosophy of history begins with Voltaire. And since the time of Voltaire, philosophy of history has known itself to be philosophy of history. Another consequence follows from Voltaire's explicit formulation of philosophy of history, and that's that modern philosophy of history begins with an Enlightenment philosophy of history, since Voltaire was one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers consciously and purposefully distanced themselves from providential philosophies of history, that is to say, the Augustinian tradition that had dominated European thought up to that time. But even at the height of the Enlightenment, providentialism continued to have its advocates, both ancient and modern. One of the many conflicts that punctuated the relationship between Voltaire and Rousseau was their antithetical interpretations of the role of divine providence in history. After the great Lisbon earthquake of 1 November 1755, Voltaire wrote a long philosophical poem in response to the popular providential accounts of the earthquake that blamed the people of Lisbon for their sinfulness as the cause of the earthquake. I quoted from this in my episode on the Lisbon earthquake. "O wretched man, earth fated to be cursed, abyss of plagues and miseries the worst, horror on horrors, griefs on griefs must show that man's the victim of unceasing woe, and lamentations which inspire my strain prove that philosophy is false and vain." Rousseau's response to Voltaire's poem took the form of a long letter dated 18 August 1756, which is now known to scholars as the Letter on Providence. It's difficult to quote an excerpt from this letter and give an honest sense of it. But Rousseau's primary objection to Voltaire was that Voltaire, in denying the role of providence, was denying the very thing that gives us hope. And so he was effectively denying human beings comfort in their hour of need. In the letter, Rousseau wrote, quote, "It is not a question of knowing if each one of us suffers or not, but if it were good that the universe has existed, and if our ills were inevitable in the constitution of the universe. Thus, the addition of an article would render, it seems, the proposition more exact, and in place of all is good, it would perhaps be worth more to say the whole is good, or that all is good for the whole. Then it is quite evident that no man would be able to give direct proofs either for or against. For these proofs depend on a perfect knowledge of the constitution of the world and of the purpose of its author. And this knowledge is incontestably beyond human intelligence. The true principles of optimism can be drawn neither from the properties of matter nor from the mechanics of the universe, but only by induction from the perfections of God who presides over all." Unquote. Rousseau was concerned to defend divine providence and optimism against what he perceived as Voltaire's attack. But the two men largely talked past each other, as is often the case when individuals with distinctively different temperaments disagree. Voltaire and Rousseau were both understood to be representatives of the Enlightenment, and William Blake so completely identified the two as being of a piece that he wrote a poem titled Mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, that begins, mock on, 'tis all in vain. You throw the sand against the wind, and the wind blows it back again." For Blake, Voltaire and Rousseau were both merely mocking that which they didn't understand. Voltaire mocked tradition and superstition, and Rousseau mocked civilization and human achievement. And today we see these as two very different things. But Blake saw only the mocking. And perhaps he was right to see this as one of the less edifying faces of the Enlightenment. And this is a face of the Enlightenment that continues to show itself in the scorn and derision that's directed against anyone and everyone who rejects the presuppositions of the Enlightenment. Today, we would say that Rousseau belongs to the counter-Enlightenment, which is to say that he was a critic of the Enlightenment from within the presuppositions of the Enlightenment, sometimes called an internal critic. Whatever presuppositions they shared, Voltaire and Rousseau saw the question of providence so differently that they had almost no ground for discussing it. Strangely enough, it might be easier to bring Voltaire into dialogue with a figure as different from him, Jacques-Bénigne Bossuet, than it is to bring him into dialogue with Rousseau. In his book, The Gateway to History, Alan Nevins presents Voltaire as a response to Bossuet, who is often regarded as one of the great representatives of a providential conception of history, and his discourse on universal history is sometimes characterized as a modern restatement of Augustine's City of God. I don't share this judgment, but it is often said. Nevins wrote, quote, "The Christian philosophy of history continued to possess the field down to the time of Bossuet's eloquent book, Histoire universelle, which largely summed it up. Voltaire, remarking caustically that it seems to have been written solely to suggest that everything in the world was made for Jews, was stung by it and similar productions into an angry reply. His essay on morals, a generation later, wholly rejected the miraculous interposition of providence in history, asserting instead a rationalistic interpretation of the past. In Voltaire's opinion, the events of history were attributable not to design, but to chance or fortuity. His brilliant, though vague, exposition helped to open the way for other rationalistic philosophies." Unquote. So philosophy of history as we know it today was largely a product of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was in part a reaction against providential conceptions of history. In this connection, I could also mention Hume's work on miracles as belonging to the same kind of response to a providential conception of the world. And of course, there's Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was controversial in its time for its naturalistic treatment of the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Gibbon, like Voltaire, was known as a philosophical historian and a representative of the Enlightenment. Karl Joachim Weintraub, in his Visions of Culture, Voltaire, Guizot, Burckhardt, Lamprecht, Huizinga, Ortega y Gasset, saw Voltaire not only as a philosophical historian, but also as a scholar of civilization. Quote, "The active concern with the history of civilization is barely 200 years old. Its first real spokesman and practitioner was Voltaire. He was strong in his condemnation of barbarism and a superb fighter for civilized existence, and his weapon was often history. He formulated a new program for historians. He struggled, as the first to do so, with the perpetual problems of cultural history, and the courage with which he advanced along untrodden trails remains an inspiration for others attacking such problems. He designed such a rich program, and he set the objectives so well that he could serve as a guide for many who came after him." Unquote. And there were many who came after him. In several episodes, I mentioned a paper by Arthur Lovejoy, the famous historian of ideas, that identifies a critical mass of progressivist philosophers of history in the late 18th and early 19th century. Though Lovejoy is interested in the Germans, so he names Kant, Herder, Schelling, and Lessing. In France, there was Turgot, Condorcet, and Guizot. And before all of them, came Voltaire. And D'Alembert was the first to follow Voltaire. It was D'Alembert's birthday last Sunday, and I had hoped to produce an episode on him and his preliminary discourse on the Encyclopedia of Diderot. Once I started to dig into this, though, I realized that it wasn't something that I could finish just then. J.G.A. Pocock, in the first volume of his Barbarism and Religion, discussed a dispute between D'Alembert and Gibbon, and is going to take some effort to give an account of this, so I'm saving D'Alembert for later. Voltaire's own book on philosophy of history is in the vein of Enlightenment philosophical history, as we've seen in the work of Gibbon and Friedrich von Schlegel. It's not really a theory of history, but a way of writing history to give the reader an explanation and an understanding of historical events, and not merely a chronicle, as we might say, to bring it into contrast with medieval history. But we can also contrast it to modern history and say that the philosophical historians, like the historians of the Annales school, were skeptical of the history of the event, where one event follows another in rapid succession, but little remains after then events have passed away and have been forgotten. Chronicles, on the one hand, and the history of event on the other, are two ways in which historians get distracted from the deeper issues posed by history, and the philosophical historians like Voltaire wanted to bring out the deeper lessons of history. For example, in his Philosophy of History, Chapter 5, on the religion of the first men, Voltaire offers a naturalistic explanation for the origins of religious beliefs. Quote, "In order to know how these different doctrines and superstitions gained ground, it seems to me necessary to follow the career of the human mind left alone without a guide. The inhabitants of a village, who are little better than savages, see the fruits perish which should nourish them. An inundation carries away some cabins. Others are destroyed by lightning. Who has done them this mischief? It could not be their fellow citizens, for all have equally suffered. It is therefore some secret power which has afflicted them, and must therefore be appeased. How is it to be effected? By using it as they do those whom they are desirous of pleasing, by making it some small presents. There is a serpent in the neighborhood. It is very likely the serpent. They offer him milk near the cavern to which he retires. From that time he becomes sacred. He is invoked when they are at war near the neighboring village, who, on their side, have chosen another protector." Unquote. A couple of paragraphs further on, he writes, quote, "Every state, then, had in the course of its time tutelary divinity, without even knowing what was meant by a god, or without in the least suspecting that the neighboring state had not, as well as itself, a real protector. For how could they think, when they had a lord, that others had not one also? The only thing in doubt was which among so many masters, lords, or gods would be victorious when the nations fought against each other." Unquote. For the Enlightenment, with its anti-clericalism and its deism, religion, especially in its traditional forms, and especially its, we could say, primitive forms to which Voltaire is alluding in this passage, Enlightenment, religion was a problem that needed to be explained for the Enlightenment. Thus, Voltaire gives us a naturalistic account of the origins of religion that satisfies the Enlightenment's need for an explanation, and he does this by giving us a state of nature thought experiment. In the early modern period, many philosophers engaged in state of nature thought experiments. Hobbes and Rousseau were particularly influential in this respect, in which humanity is imagined prior to the advent of civilization. And on the basis of this thought experiment, an attempt is made at a rational reconstruction of the earliest history of humanity when the distinctive institutions of civilization were founded. Rousseau's state of nature thought experiment led to rather different conclusions than most Enlightenment thinkers, as is to be expected from an internal critic of the Enlightenment using the methods of the Enlightenment, but often rejecting Enlightenment judgments. In his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality Among Men, Rousseau wrote, quote, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how much misery and horror the human race would have been spared if someone had pulled up the stakes and filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, 'Beware of this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone and that the earth itself belongs to no one.'" Unquote. Rousseau sent Voltaire a copy of his discourse, and Rousseau responded in a famous letter to Rousseau dated 30 August 1755, quote, "I have received, sir, your new book against the human race, and I thank you for it. You will please people by your manner of telling them the truth about themselves, but you will not alter them. The horrors of that human society have never been painted in more striking colors. No one has ever been so witty as you are in trying to turn us into brutes. To read your books makes one long to go about on all fours. Since, however, it is now some 60 years since I gave up the practice, I feel that it is unfortunately impossible for me to resume it. I leave this natural habit to those more fit for it than you or I. Nor can I set sail to discover the aborigines of Canada, in the first place because my ill health ties me to the side of the greatest doctor in Europe, and I should not find the same professional assistance among the Missouris. And secondly, because war is going on in that country, and the example of the civilized nations has made the barbarians almost as wicked as we are ourselves." Unquote. Again, the temperamental differences between Rousseau and Voltaire prevent them from finding any common ground, but their common use of state of nature thought experiments, deriving from these thought experiments insights that can be used to write the history of unrecorded events, constitute a kind of rational reconstruction of history. Not history as it actually happened, since we have no records of the state of nature as imagined by Hobbes, Rousseau, and Voltaire, but a speculative reconstruction of history as it might have been, or in the minds of some, history as it must have been, given what we do know, even if we have no record of what actually happened. This early modern rational reconstruction of history that has been since lost to the mists of time bears some resemblance to Collingwood's a priori historical imagination. Collingwood's a priori historical imagination was about interpolating into history that which had to have happened, even if we have no record of it. And this is part of what the Enlightenment state of nature thought experiments were trying to accomplish. One can then think of later philosophies of history that employ the technique of the imaginative reconstruction of that which had to have been, though all evidence of it is lost, as a refinement of the earlier technique of state of nature thought experiments, which, as an earlier tool of philosophy of history, were something of a blunt instrument. But Collingwood was working in the idealist tradition, and this makes him as temperamentally averse to Voltaire and his legacy as was Rousseau. At the same time as Collingwood was developing his idealistic philosophy of history in the early 20th century, a very different kind of rational reconstruction, thoroughly naturalistic in spirit, was being formulated by logical empiricists, some of whom saw their task in metaphorical terms as the reconstruction of a ship at sea, with the ship being scientific knowledge and the reconstruction being the techniques of logical empiricism as a philosophical foundation for scientific knowledge. But the logical empiricists were as little interested in history as was Descartes, their spiritual forebear, who had initiated the philosophical foundations of the scientific revolution, which the logical empiricists saw themselves as continuing and taking to its logical conclusion. If the logical empiricists had applied the methods of the rational reconstruction of knowledge to historical knowledge, we might have had a naturalistic philosophy of history in the early 20th century, but that window has closed and now it's a lost opportunity. Throughout these episodes of Today in Philosophy of History, I've suggested that it would be possible to frame a naturalistic philosophy of history, and there's a sense in which Voltaire's philosophy of history was already naturalistic at the beginning of Enlightenment philosophies of history, but the tradition took a different turn with the progressivist philosophers of history that emerged in the generation after Voltaire. The direct descendant of Voltaire's philosophy of history might have been a fully naturalistic philosophy of history, but this remains a counterfactual and, in a sense, another lost opportunity in the history of philosophy of history, like the possibility of an early 20th century rational reconstruction of historical knowledge along the lines of logical empiricism. An unspoken naturalistic philosophy of history has been the presupposition of most philosophical history after Voltaire, but in terms of an explicitly formulated philosophy of history, naturalism has had very little influence. Happy birthday, Voltaire, and thanks for listening.